Berlin 1945. One suitcase on a road of ash, the fall of Nazi Germany. The city was burning, the sky was shaking, and she carried everything she had left in one small suitcase. In the final days of World War, Berlin was no longer the proud capital that Nazi propaganda had once shown to the world. The city had become a broken maze of smoke, rubble, fire, and fear. Streets that had once carried cars, trams, workers, and children were now covered with bricks, shattered glass, torn wires, and the remains of collapsed buildings. The sound of artillery never seemed to stop. It rolled through the city like thunder, shaking the walls, breaking windows, and forcing people deeper into basements and shelters. For one young German civilian woman, the end of the war did not arrive as a speech, a flag, or a headline. It arrived as dust falling from the ceiling of her damaged apartment. It arrived as the smell of smoke in the stairwell. It arrived as the realization that her home was no longer a place of safety. She stood in a room that had once held the ordinary details of life. Clothes, photographs, a small table, perhaps a cup left near the window. Now everything was covered in ash. The walls were cracked, the windows were gone. Outside, the city trembled under the final assault. She had only one suitcase. There was no time to choose carefully in a city collapsing by the hour. Every object became a question: food or clothing, papers or family memories, something warm or something valuable. She packed what she could, not because it was enough, but because it was all she could carry. Then she stepped out of the apartment and into a Berlin that no longer felt like a living city. The hallway was dark. Neighbors whispered behind doors or hurried past with bundles in their arms. Somewhere below, someone was crying. Somewhere above, another explosion sent dust down the stairwell. On the street, the air was thick with smoke and the bitter smell of burning wood, fuel, and masonry. The sky was gray and low, stained by fire. Buildings stood like broken shells, their interiors exposed to the world. Furniture hung from shattered rooms. Curtains moved in empty windows. The city looked as if it had been torn open. She walked because staying still was no longer possible. Behind her was an apartment that could collapse or burn. Ahead of her was no clear destination. Only the hope of finding a shelter, a safer street, or someone who still knew what to do. Around her, civilians moved in the same direction, and then suddenly changed course when shells landed nearby. Some carried bags, some carried blankets, some carried nothing at all. Their faces were gray with exhaustion. They no longer looked like citizens of a capital. They looked like people trapped inside the ruins of history.
Keep your head down.
As she passed a damaged intersection, the old symbols of power seemed useless. Posters were torn. Official signs hung crooked from walls. Military vehicles sat abandoned in the street, burned or broken. Wounded soldiers moved through the rubble with hollow eyes, no longer appearing like men who could protect anyone. Some were very young, some were limping, some had lost their units entirely. Their uniforms were dirty, their authority gone. The war that had once been presented as destiny had become confusion, hunger, fear, and retreat. The shelters were overcrowded. When she reached one, people were already packed inside, shoulder to shoulder. The air was heavy with sweat, damp clothing, smoke, and fear. Old people sat against the walls. Women held bags and blankets. Men stared silently at the floor. Every explosion above made the ceiling tremble, and every tremor made people look upward, wondering if this would be the shell that buried them alive. No one spoke of victory. No one spoke of grand ideas. By then, most people wanted only water, bread, sleep, and one more morning. But even the shelters were not truly safe. News moved through them in fragments. A street had fallen. A bridge was blocked. A building had been hit. Soviet troops were closer. German defenses were collapsing. No one knew which rumor was true, but everyone could feel the same truth pressing down on them. Berlin was falling. The young woman held her suitcase close, as if it could still connect her to the person she had been before the city turned to ash. But the longer she walked, the heavier it became. Not just because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. A life reduced to one hand, a home reduced to a few objects, a future reduced to a road through smoke. Outside again, the streets were worse. Fire burned in the distance. Telephone poles leaned over the road. Bricks slid under her shoes. She passed a crater where a street had once been flat. She passed a group of civilians trying to move a wounded man. She passed soldiers who no longer looked at anyone. The noise of the battle rose and fell, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. Every corner could reveal a new danger. Every open street felt exposed. Every doorway looked like a possible shelter or a possible trap. As the final battle tightened around Berlin, the old regime disappeared not in one dramatic instant, but piece by piece. Offices stopped functioning. Orders stopped making sense. Soldiers were sent into hopeless positions. Civilians were left to understand the collapse for themselves. The slogans that had filled the city for years now seemed like ghosts. They could not stop the artillery. They could not rebuild the houses. They could not feed the hungry or protect the frightened. For this young woman, the fall of Nazi Germany was not an abstract historical event. It was the road beneath her feet. It was the smoke in her lungs. It was the suitcase cutting into her hand. It was the sight of Berlin, once the center of a brutal empire, reduced to ruins around ordinary people who had nowhere left to go.
Keep moving.
She did not know when the firing would stop. She did not know who would control the next street. She did not know whether the shelter ahead would have space, or whether the building behind her would still be standing by nightfall. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, and so she walked through Berlin with one suitcase, past broken walls, burned vehicles, shattered glass, and faces emptied by fear. Around her, the Third Reich was dying, not as a legend, not as glory, but as smoke, hunger, silence, and ash. By the time history changed forever, she was not watching it from a distance. She was walking through it, one step at a time, carrying the last pieces of her life down a road of ruins.